My name is Dana Asby, and I will be your webinar manager and host. Thank you for joining our webinar, Poverty, Brain Development, and Early Interventions. Today's meeting will last approximately 1 hour with a brief 15-minute meeting of the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative Fellows afterwards. Microphones will be muted during the presentation, but at designated times during question and answer sessions, you can raise your hand to request an open mic. We'll also open all mics at some points in the discussion. Thanks to a partnership with C4 Innovations, we're offering 1.25 hours of continuing education credit for each webinar in this series. We can also offer you a certificate of participation. Information about that, as well as the slideshow, will be sent to you via email. Registration affirms your consent to receive an evaluation follow-up link. If you experience any technical issues during this webinar, please send a private chat to Ingrid Paget, our technical support manager for today's webinar. We're pleased that you joined the webinar, and I'd now like to introduce Dr. Christine Mason, founder and executive director of the Center for Educational Improvement and project director of the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative.
Welcome, everyone. Glad you're joining us today. And Dr. Noble, we are so pleased that you are able to present. Dana tells me some fascinating things about your research. So we are really looking forward to today's session and to all of those of you who are joining us today. If you'd like to know more about the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative, you can reach out to any of us after this session, and we're happy to give you an update.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mason and Dana, for having me. It's really a pleasure to speak with you all today. Are we okay to go ahead and start? All
yes.
Right. Great. All right. So the human brain has been termed the most complex 3 pounds in the universe. And it's not hard to see why when we consider the fact that we're born with 100 billion neurons or brain cells at birth, and we develop between 250,000 and 500,000 new neurons or brain cells every minute in the first few months of life. But what I find particularly fascinating is that most growth isn't just the development of new brain cells, but the connections between these cells. And these brain connections, or synapses, become increasingly complex in the first several years of life. So this is a picture shown of brain cells under the microscope at birth and at 3 months and at 2 years of age. You can see that these connections between our brain cells become increasingly more complex. And in fact, we have 1,000 trillion synapses or connections between our brain cells by the time we're 3 years old. Now, critically, early experience shapes this brain developmental process. So you all may have heard of the so-called use it or lose it phenomenon, whereby connections that are used frequently are strengthened, whereas those that are not are dropped or pruned. And it turns out that the brain is most plastic or able to make new brain connections early in childhood. Now, of course, a child's experience varies tremendously as a function of his or her family's social and economic circumstances. And so we can use social and economic factors as a lens through which to better understand this early brain development process. So as a bit of background, what is poverty? Well, poverty represents an income level defined by the federal government in the United States based on family size and composition, meaning the number of adults and children in the home. Now, interestingly, it doesn't vary geographically, and so that means that a family of 4 living here in New York City has the same poverty line set for them as a family of 4 in rural South Dakota, even though, of course, the cost of living is quite different in those places. Now, currently, the poverty line for a family with 2 adults and 2 children is set at just under $26,000. And although it can be quite challenging to imagine raising a family of 4 on that amount of money in a high cost of living place like New York City, it's nonetheless quite prevalent, currently impacting around 1 in 5 children around the U.S. So this is just a chart showing you poverty rates over the last 50 or so years, and the purple line represents childhood poverty over that time. And of course, as we all know, growing up in poverty puts children at risk for a host of negative outcomes in terms of their physical health, mental health, and school achievement. Now, when we talk about socioeconomic status, or SES, we're talking about more than just poverty. I just told you that poverty is defined based on family income, whereas SES is thought to comprise income, but other socioeconomic characteristics as well, like parents' educational attainment, occupational prestige, and subjective social status, or where one sees oneself on the social hierarchy. And we know that when we conceptualize childhood SES in this way, it tends to be strongly associated with a number of important cognitive developmental outcomes for children. Things like achievement test scores, grade retention, literacy, IQ, and school graduation. And it turns out that this socioeconomic gap in achievement tends to emerge early and then widen throughout the elementary years. So the data I'm about to show you come from the British Cohort study of 1970. Which followed tens of thousands of children in the United Kingdom longitudinally from about age 2 to about age 10. Now, of course, as you all know, we wouldn't give the same set of cognitive tests to a 2-year-old as we would to a 10-year-old. So here on the y-axis, we have cognitive performance in percentile, meaning where children performed relative to other same-age children. Okay. So first, I'm going to draw your attention to children who started out at age 2. And the first group I'm going to show you were kids who started out performing at the 90th percentile, meaning they were outperforming 90% of other 2-year-old children on this battery of cognitive tests. And I'm first going to show you these kids who happen to come from socioeconomically advantaged homes. So those 2-year-olds who were from higher SES backgrounds, who were high early scorers, tended to perform above average throughout the course of childhood. Next, I'm going to draw your attention to kids who at age 2 performed at only the 10th percentile, meaning they were outperforming only 10% of other 2-year-olds. They were scoring below 90% of other 2-year-olds. And I'm going to first highlight those kids who started out at the 10th percentile who happen to come from socioeconomically disadvantaged homes. So those children from lower SES backgrounds who were low early scorers tended to perform below average throughout the course of childhood. So far, nothing I've told you is tremendously surprising. A bit more surprising, though, is what happened to what we might term the crossover groups. So next, I want you to consider children who also started out at the 10th percentile, so outperforming only 10% of other 2-year-olds, but who happen to come from socioeconomically advantaged backgrounds. So those children who were from higher SES backgrounds, but who were low early scorers, actually rose in their relative rank over the course of childhood, such that by age 10, they were performing at or even a little bit above average. And finally, and most disconcertingly, we can ask, what happened to those children who started out performing better than 90% of other 2-year-olds, but who happened to come from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds? So those children actually fell in their relative rank over the course of childhood, such that by age 10, family socioeconomic circumstance is actually a much better predictor of children's cognitive skill than is early cognitive performance. Now, of course, it's not the case that anybody fell in their absolute level of skills, right? Everyone improved in their absolute level of skills between age 2 and age 10, but here we're talking about their relative skills compared to other same-age children. So I think this is a particularly stark illustration of the emergence of socioeconomic disparities in children's cognitive development over the course of childhood. But it really begs the question as to what factors might be accounting for these links. So I think I'm supposed to pause here and allow Dr. Mason to ask a couple questions.
So, Dr. Noble, you've given us some startling information. I mean, dramatic differences according to SES. And I'm considering a couple things. One is, I wonder if you have any idea of what happens according to race or culture. Does that seem to make a difference?
Yeah. So various studies have looked at that in different ways, and it does seem to make a difference. So in many, well, I should say some work suggests that a good amount of the Black-white achievement gap is accounted for by SES. But the general consensus seems to be that not all of the gap across racial groups can be accounted for by SES. And there are a lot of potentially good reasons for that, right? Differences in things like concentrated poverty, discrimination, school quality that may vary along racial lines independent of SES. And so, you know, put simply, it's become pretty clear, especially in recent years, that growing up as an underprivileged minority is potentially very different from growing up underprivileged, but as a child being from a white family.
A related question might be to let us consider for a moment children growing up in other countries, and particularly those that may be considered third world or underdeveloped countries. Mm-hmm. Do you know anything about the impact of poverty in those countries?
Yeah, a little bit is known. And so I'll show you some data shortly looking at specific cognitive differences across socioeconomic groups here in the US. And although I'm not going to show you data on that, we see very similar disparities in very poor countries. So there does seem to be something about inequality, even if the entire span would be considered poor by US standards. There does seem to be something about inequality or wealth gradients that still leads to disparities in outcomes.
And my last question this time relates to things we think about all the time as educators. You know, what can we do to make a difference? I mean, certainly some of your research is going to show us a few things, but I'm thinking about traditional things like Head Start, Absolutely. You know, early childhood programs. Do those help?
Absolutely. And so, you know, sort of toward the end of the talk, I'll talk about various approaches that one can take. So very broadly speaking, to foreshadow a bit, you know, I think that socioeconomic disparities are sort of the root problem, and they lead to differences in experiences for children, which in turn lead to differences in development and behavior. And so you can imagine tackling the problem anywhere along that pathway, right? So you could focus on specific kinds of cognitive disparities through school interventions, for example. You can take a step back and try to change children's experiences, often through home-based interventions. And then taking a step even further back, we can try to address societal problems by looking at ways to address the disparities themselves. And I think there's unlikely to be a single silver bullet, right? I think we're going to need a multi-pronged approach.
Seems like all of those are very important. And so thank you so much for this part.
Of course, my pleasure. All right, so as Dr. Mason mentioned, you know, that's a particularly dramatic illustration of socioeconomic disparities in childhood, but it really begs the question as to what might be going on here. What factors are contributing to this SES gap in achievement? And of course, we can think of many, right? Differences in nutrition, differences in access to prenatal care or perinatal medical care, perinatal complications, perhaps differences in prenatal drug exposure or exposure to environmental toxicants like secondhand smoke or lead, differences in the home learning environment or schooling or stress. And to this laundry list and the many others that you all could certainly come up with, I would say, you know, broadly, yes, each of those factors has been shown to contribute in part to the link between family socioeconomic circumstance and children's cognitive skill. So how do we make sense of that? Well, one way is to recognize that so-called cognitive skill is really too broad of an outcome to be considering. So what do I mean by that? Well, traditional achievement measures like IQ or school graduation rates aren't specific in terms of the way our brains work, right? There's no one high school graduation part of our brain. But as neuroscientists, we can be much more specific in terms of asking which particular cognitive skills and the corresponding brain circuitry seems to vary the most as a function of socioeconomic factors. So this brings us to a neuroscience approach. So neuroscience teaches us that different structures and circuits in the brain support different kinds of cognitive skills, things like language or memory or self-regulation, among others. And so by taking a neuroscience framework, we can ask which core cognitive systems are the most highly associated with family SES. And so that's exactly the approach that we took back when I was a graduate student over 15 years ago now, in which we recruited several socioeconomically diverse cohorts of families with young children ranging in age from kindergarten on up through adolescence. And in those initial studies, we engaged the children and adolescents in various types of cognitive tasks that we knew sort of preferentially relied on some brain circuits and less so on others. So in that way, we were able to hone in a little bit more specifically as to what might be underlying these big differences in, for example, IQ, to better understand what are the particular types of cognitive skills that seem to vary the most along socioeconomic lines. And in these different studies with different groups of kids of different ages, our results were actually fairly consistent. So here I'm showing you data from one study of 150 New York City first graders, again from very socioeconomically diverse backgrounds, in which we found pretty large differences along socioeconomic lines in children's language development, with more modest but still consistent differences in their memory development, as well as their ability to regulate their thoughts and feelings. And so that general pattern, sort of large differences in language, modest differences in memory and self-regulation, really seemed to be the pattern that we saw across different studies. And I will pause here.
So, Dr. Noble,
Sure.
in many ways, these data are very distressing. Just to consider the huge number of children living in poverty and what little things we really do on a societal level.
Mm-hmm.
So in our work, a lot of what we do is we focus on trauma as well. And of course, you know the research that really says that there's some relationship between attachment and whether or not someone who's young really has a parent there, a guardian, someone they can turn to and count on. And what happens with the brain, the executive functioning, and things like memory and self-regulation. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, do you think that trauma is one of these factors that may be associated more with SES as well?
Absolutely. And we'll be speaking in a few moments about links between SES and family stress more broadly, of which I would say trauma is one component, and in turn links between stress and very specific brain circuits that we know are highly sensitive to stress that support cognitive skills like memory and self-regulation. So I think your intuition is exactly right on and very well supported by the neuroscience evidence suggesting that trauma has direct impact on certain brain regions, and that may in fact account for some of these links between socioeconomic disparities and children's outcomes.
So I would just summarize here, one of the things we want everyone to consider then is when you're trying to increase academic achievement, sometimes it's really important to focus on something other than just the academics.
Absolutely.
Or the cognitive skills.
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. So, again, it's sort of a good reminder if we think about sort of going from broader factors to more narrow factors in a way, right? Thinking about broad societal disparities, the differences in experience to ultimate outcomes, right? We could apply interventions to outcomes. It's not to say those aren't important, but in some ways you've already had the impact, right? So then if you take a step back and try to impact the child's experience, along the lines of what you're talking about, interventions that focus on mitigating or reducing trauma or mitigating the impact of trauma, that has the potential to be, very far-reaching.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so we showed socioeconomic differences in children's language development, more modest differences in memory and self-regulation. And those findings really led to several branches of ongoing research that my lab is currently following. So I'm going to sort of lay out 4 ongoing questions and then present a little bit of data as to how we're addressing those questions. So the first question is, if we see these socioeconomic differences in children's cognitive development, how do they relate to underlying differences in the structure and function of children's brains? Number 2, those first studies I told you had children who ranged in age from kindergarten on up through adolescence. So we reasoned that, if we're already seeing differences by the start of formal schooling, they must emerge earlier. But when? So when in infancy or early childhood can we first detect differences? And that, of course, has implications for timing of screening. Number 3, which experiences, especially modifiable experiences, might explain socioeconomic differences in cognitive and brain development? And then finally, as we've already alluded to, how can this work inform interventions? All right, so addressing the first question, how do these differences in children's cognitive development relate to underlying differences in their brain structure? Well, a few years ago, I had the good fortune of working with the Pediatric Imaging, Neurocognition, and Genetics, or PING, investigators who had at the time done something that was really quite unprecedented. So they had recruited more than 1,000 children and teens from 10 cities around the country to participate in what we call high-resolution brain imaging. So they each got an MRI scan, so a sort of very detailed picture of their brains. And the original Ping study set out not to ask questions about SES per se, but to ask questions about sort of normal, typical, healthy, age-appropriate brain development. So, looking at these 1,000+ children and teens, how do brains change with age across childhood and adolescence? Now, we were able to take advantage of the fact that these nearly 1,100 individuals came from very diverse families around the United States. And so we were able to ask, how do socioeconomic factors like parents' educational attainment or family income relate to children's brain structure over and above the effect of age? And one thing that we were very interested in was the surface area of the cerebral cortex, which is the thin outer layer of cells on our brains that does most of the cognitive heavy lifting. And that's because past work by other scientists has suggested that the surface area, or sort of the size of the nooks and crannies on the cortex, has been related to children's intelligence. And so we wondered whether we would see differences in the size of the surface area as a function of socioeconomic factors. And so just to orient you, for those of you who may not be used to looking at brain images, this is the front of the brain, this is the back. This is a picture along the lateral or side surface of the brain. Here again, this is the front of the brain, this is the back, and this is a picture looking straight down the middle of the brain. Okay, and these are averages of all 1,000+ children and teens in the study. So they sort of averaged those photos or images together. Now here in these images, every point you see in color is a point where higher family income was associated with a larger cortical surface area, or a larger surface area of that cerebral cortex I mentioned. And so what you see is that higher family income was associated with larger cortical surface area across nearly the entire surface of the brain. Okay, so that's striking and unusual in brain science to see one factor that seems to influence the brain so profusely. Secondly, you see that there are some areas shown in yellow where you sort of see a differential impact, where in those regions, higher income was particularly associated with cortical surface area. And as shown in this figure, those are areas that we know are very important for language development, as well as executive function, or the ability to regulate our thoughts and feelings. And so the brain results really supported what we had previously found behaviorally, that the biggest differences across socioeconomic lines seem to be in brain development that supports language and self-regulation. Now, there's a couple points to note. This link between family income and children's brain structure was strongest among the most disadvantaged children. So that means that dollar for dollar, relatively small differences in family income were associated with proportionately greater differences in brain structure among the most disadvantaged families. And intuitively, that kind of makes sense, right? An extra $10,000 for a family earning $100,000 a year would certainly be nice, but probably not dramatically change their day-to-day lives. Whereas an extra $10,000 for a family only earning $20,000 a year would potentially be quite big change. Secondly, and if you remember one thing from this whole talk, it should be this: there was quite a bit of variability from one child to the next, by which I mean there were plenty of children from higher income homes with smaller brain sizes, plenty of children from lower income homes with larger brain sizes. So in no way could I know an individual child's family income and predict with any accuracy what that particular child's brain would look like. Okay. It's really, really important. There are lots of factors at play here. Okay, so moving on to our second question, just how early in infancy or early childhood are these effects detectable? So turning first to looking at behavioral differences, what we seem to be able to see is that even before children turn 2, we're seeing differences. So this is a study where we followed a group of infants and toddlers longitudinally from 9 to 15 and 15 to 21 months of age. Here I'm showing you scores on a language composite where a score of 0 means they were performing right at the mean, at the average for that age. Above 0 is above average and below 0 is below average. And on this slide, I'm showing you that the kids of the more highly educated parents are shown in blue, Kids of middle-educated parents are shown in red, and the kids of the least educated parents in this sample are shown in green. And so what you see is that from 9 to 15 months, you're seeing pretty flat lines, meaning you're not really seeing the emergence of language differences as a function of parents' education just yet. But from 15 to 21 months, what you see is that this blue line is rising to the top of the distribution, whereas unfortunately this green line is falling to the bottom of the distribution. And so that difference between the blue line and the green line is not just what we call statistically significant, but clinically significant as well. It's equivalent in magnitude to about 12 IQ points. Now again, this wasn't an IQ test, it was a test of language ability, but it nonetheless gives you a sense of just how large the differences already are before children even turn 2. And we see a very similar pattern when we look at children's memory development. Again, that difference between the blue line and green line is similar in magnitude to about 12 IQ points by 21 months of age. Now, what about what's going on under the hood, right? Taking a look at brain development early in childhood. Now, the pictures I showed you before were taken using MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. If any of you have ever had an MRI, you know it involves sitting perfectly still in a dark and noisy tube, which is not so bad if you're an adult or an older child, not great for our youngest research participants. So instead, we pull out a different tool in the toolbox, namely electroencephalography, or EEG, shown here. With EEG, the child can sit comfortably on his or her caretaker's lap. It involves putting this cap of electrodes on their heads, it's colloquially known as brainwaves. And so using EEG, we can measure the electrical activity at the scalp, which reflects the underlying electrical activity of the brain. And then this signal is then decomposed into different frequency bands that look like this. And very broadly speaking, we know from past work from other scientists that kids who are at risk for learning and attention problems tend to exhibit a relative excess of these low frequency oscillations and a relative deficit of these high frequency oscillations. So everyone's brain has patterns of activity across the frequency band. So everybody has some high frequency and everybody has some low frequency, but we know that kids with relatively more low frequency oscillations are more likely to have learning and attention problems in school. And so not too long ago, I had a trainee, Dr. Natalie Brito, who's now on the faculty of NYU, who asked just how early might we be able to detect differences in brain function as a function of family socioeconomic circumstance. So she actually did EEG with newborn babies, so within the first 4 days of life, to ask whether socioeconomic factors predicted brain function. And the answer was a resounding no. So she found absolutely no evidence of any links between parents' education or family income and brain function anywhere across the head in any frequency band at birth. So it suggests the potential that the emergence of these disparities occurs as a result of postnatal experience, because we're not seeing them yet when kids are born, but they do emerge later. I think I'm supposed to pause here.
So reflecting back on what you said, are there ways then that we can modify what happens in terms of the brain development and the brain waves as we're seeing them?
So that's exactly what we're studying currently, right? So I guess the broad answer is yes. It's well established that the brain, particularly in childhood, is very plastic, is very malleable to experience. So, you know, if you have someone practice playing a violin a whole lot, then parts of their brain responsible like for, you know, their left-hand finger movements are going to change over the course of that time. And similar studies have been done showing other kinds of plasticity in response to other kinds of stimulation or lessons or what have you. So certainly the brain is very plastic. The brain is able to be changed. Now, what can we do to prevent or mitigate disparities that emerge as a result of early adversity? That is something that I think you know, very heavily sought after, and something that we're very interested in. And I'll be showing you a bit about some of the ways we think we might go about approaching this.
So I'm reflecting on a few things I know from, you know, my past research or study, and part of it had to do with how parents interact with the child.
Absolutely.
And so I'd just like to make the point that I think that not only do we work with the child, but there's things that can be done by working with the parents.
Absolutely. And so when we think about changing children's experiences, a lot of that is going to be mediated by parent-child interactions, right? So whether it's teaching parents to talk more or to talk differently, or teaching parents ways to sort of reduce their own stress in order to be able to be more nurturing, I think all of those are approaches that potentially confer valuable effects for the child.
So thank you.
All right, so the excellent segue, because sort of our third line of questioning is what particular experiences might explain these differences, because of course those have the potential to serve as targets for intervention. So I showed you this slide earlier. In my lab, we're particularly interested in two types of experience and every month, they went into the homes of these families and for a few hours put a tape recorder near the child and tape recorded every word that the child said and every word that the child heard. They then took these tape recorders back to their lab, where some poor research assistant had to transcribe everything. And what they found was that over and over at every age, children from more advantaged backgrounds tended to hear more words than the children from less advantaged backgrounds. And so when the authors extrapolated that out and calculated what that meant for every waking minute over the first several years of the children's lives, they calculated that this amounted to a 30 million word gap in terms of the number of words heard by the more advantaged children compared to the less advantaged children. Subsequently, researchers showed that it wasn't just the number of words that varied, but also the complexity and the responsiveness or back and forth conversational nature of the verbal interactions that varied as a function of socioeconomic background. And in turn, other work showed that the number of words children heard was directly related to their vocabulary size. Now, I showed you a few moments ago that parts of the brain where we see the greatest disparities are the very parts of the brain that support language. And so we reasoned that perhaps these differences in the home language environment might explain socioeconomic differences in brain structure in these regions. Now we have it a little bit better than Hart and Risley and their core research assistants, because we're able to use this device known as the LENA, or Language Environments Analysis Tool. It's basically a small digital recorder that fits in specialized clothing. The child can wear it for up to 16 hours across a number of days. They then hopefully give us back the recorder, and specialized software analyzes the number of words that the children hear over the course of the day. And so in this way, we can actually look in a very fine-grained way about what the child's language exposure is like and examine the extent to which it relates to their brain structure. And what we found was that children who experience more conversational turns or back and forth responsive interactions with an adult have a larger surface area in that part of the brain that I mentioned that we know is responsible for language development. And in fact, this difference in brain structure partially accounted for disparities in reading skill in these children. And one thing I found particularly interesting is that we didn't find any link between children's brain structure and the number of words that they themselves were saying. So it wasn't just that more chatty children had different brains. It really did seem to be something about these interactions, parent-child interactions with a responsive adult, that was driving brain development. Okay. Now what can I tell you about the bottom arm of the model? So certainly growing up in socioeconomic disadvantage tends to be associated with higher family stress, as you would imagine, in terms of things like limitations of material resources, chaos in the home, sometimes exposure to neighborhood violence. And we know that when family life is characterized by stress, relationships are more likely to be characterized by conflict or withdrawal rather than the kinds of warm and nurturing parenting that we know is so important for children. Now, we and others have shown that children from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds are likely to have altered levels of stress hormones like cortisol. And we know from decades of animal research as well as some human research that there are certain areas of the brain that are very, very sensitive to stress and stress hormones. As I mentioned earlier, the hippocampus, shown here in green, that supports memory development, as well as parts of prefrontal cortex that are important for self-regulation. And so we reasoned that perhaps differences in chronic stress might explain socioeconomic differences in these brain regions. So how are we operationalizing chronic stress? A few different ways. We ask parents about their stressful experiences, their perceptions of stress, stressful life events, home chaos, family routines, their own mental health. We also take measures of stress hormone or cortisol, which we can get by taking a small hair sample of both the parent and the child. And what we're finding is that we are seeing socioeconomic differences in hair cortisol. So in this case, I'm showing you that children whose parents are more highly educated tend to have lower levels of hair cortisol or stress hormone. And that holds even when adjusting for the parent's own hair cortisol. In turn, more recently, we found that children with higher levels of hair cortisol tend to have a smaller hippocampus, which again is that area I showed you in green earlier that we know is very important for memory development. And so, as I've alluded to several times through the talk, we think that distal socioeconomic factors like parents' education or family income lead to differences in children's experience. The examples I showed you were differences in the home language environment or differences in family stress, broadly defined, which in turn lead to differences in children's brain development and ultimately their cognitive and behavioral development. And so if we're right and experience matters, it begs the question as to whether this work can inform interventions, and if so, what's the right level at which to intervene? And so you can sort of imagine intervening anywhere along this pathway, right? So we'll sort of talk about the relative pros and cons of different types of approaches. So certainly we can imagine intervening at what I'll call the most proximal level, at the level of cognition itself, most commonly through school-based interventions. So like we said earlier, there are loads of examples of interventions implemented in schools focused on children's reading development or children's self-regulation, among other things. And in many, it's certainly the most common form of intervention that tries to address socioeconomic disparities in achievement. And in many cases, results can be very promising. But I think as any intervention scientist in schools would tell you, school-based interventions can be very labor-intensive. They're sometimes costly if done right. They're often also plagued by a phenomenon known as fade-out, which I imagine many of you are familiar with, which is the idea that shortly after the cessation of an intervention, we might see positive impacts. But then if you go back to those same children 6 months or a year or several years later, often those positive effects fade away. And so it's not to say, perhaps the intervention would be more effective if it were longer lasting or if you were able to give a booster dose. But then, of course, it adds to the cost and to the labor intensiveness. And finally, I would say, while I would be the last person to deny the critical importance of high-quality early childhood education, if we're waiting until school to intervene at all, we're probably waiting too late. I already mentioned that in many cases, we see pretty remarkable disparities in child development before children even turn 2. So if we're waiting until kindergarten or even preschool to intervene, we're almost certainly behind the 8 ball already. So what about taking a step back and trying to change children's experience, most commonly through parenting interventions? So parenting interventions tend to be home-based, though not always. Sometimes you'll see parenting interventions implemented through pediatricians' offices, for example. And again, while there are a number of really high-quality, excellent examples of parenting interventions, as I think you would all agree with, they can be hard to do. Right? Again, it can be labor intensive, it's sometimes costly. And also I would say, to some extent, when you're doing a school-based intervention, once the school buys in, you have something of a captive audience. Certainly not completely, obviously there can be differences in fidelity. But once the school administration says, yes, we're doing this intervention, you don't often have that much choice as to whether the classroom or the child is going to participate. In contrast with parenting interventions, most commonly parents are sort of recruited one family at a time, so it can be difficult to reach families. It can be difficult to keep them in the program. And then finally, I would say it's from sort of a research perspective, it's one thing to bring 100 families, into a university lab twice a week for 8 weeks. It's quite another thing to be able to think of ways to be able to scale up parenting interventions to the community level or beyond. So I really applaud those of you who are working on that type of intervention. It's a real challenge. And so finally, for the remainder of the talk, I'd like to challenge you to think about what it might look like to intervene at the most distal level by really focusing on changing socioeconomic disparities themselves. So first, a little bit of background. So work by my social science colleagues has suggested that relatively small differences in family income can be associated with relatively large outcome differences for those children. So as an example, a difference in just $4,000 in annual income between the prenatal year and age 2 has been associated with improved school achievement test scores for those kids, increased earnings when those children grow up, increased time spent employed, and even some evidence for improved health when those children grow up. But those studies were entirely correlational, meaning we could say that higher family income was associated with those outcome differences, but we can't say for sure whether income was actually causing those outcome differences. And as you can imagine, there are plenty of people out there who would say, well, poverty is not really the cause of all these problems. It's just associated with it. Really, the cause is, for example, whether you're willing to pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. And from a purely scientific perspective, it's really hard to argue one way or another, because we can say that two factors are correlated or associated with each other, but without changing one, you can't say for sure whether one is causing the other. And so in order to move past correlation and really ask whether changing income causes differences, we need to do a very certain kind of scientific study, namely a clinical trial. And so I'm really pleased to be one of the principal investigators of the Baby's First Year study, which is the first clinical trial of poverty reduction in early childhood. And I've put these pictures down here to remind me to tell you that this is very much a group and interdisciplinary effort. On the left here, we have a group of social scientists. So this is Greg Duncan, who's an economist, Catherine Magnuson, who's a social policy expert, Lisa Janetian, who's a behavioral economist, and Hiro Yoshikawa is a community and developmental psychologist. I'm leading the neuroscience effort along with my colleague Nathan Fox. And so what are we actually doing? Well, we spent the last year or so recruiting 1,000 low-income mothers shortly after they gave birth in a number of hospitals around the country. Now, all mothers, upon being enrolled in the study, were provided with a monthly cash gift that they were free to spend however they liked. But importantly, the mothers were being randomized to one of two groups. So one group, the treatment group, is receiving $333 a month. And they're getting that money every month for the first 40 months of their children's lives, so till just after their children turn 3. The other group, the control group, is also getting a cash gift every month for 40 months, but they're only getting $20 a month, or $240 a year. So that difference between those groups is similar, is about $4,000 a year, so it's similar in magnitude to what I mentioned earlier, sort of differences in family income that have been associated with meaningful differences for the kids. And importantly, it's also what we believe is a policy relevant amount, meaning that it's similar in magnitude to social services and benefits that moms might otherwise qualify for, things like the Earned Income Tax Credit or food stamps. Put another way, even if we were able to raise the funds to give every family $50,000 a year, that would be unlikely to be translated into policy. And so we wanted to pick an amount that we thought would be likely to move the needle for these children, but also that had some policy relevance. And so upon enrolling in the study, they get a debit card that comes preloaded with the first month of funds. The debit card then automatically reloads every month for the next 40 months. And so in this way, we'll be able to track the causal impact of poverty reduction across these two groups on children's cognitive, emotional, and brain development in the first 3 years of life, which is the very time that, as neuroscientists, we believe that the developing brain may be most malleable to experience. So I'm pleased to say that the Baby's First Year study was funded by NIH as well as a consortium of now 20 foundations. We launched back in May of 2018, and we did complete recruitment several months ago. We're now engaged in the very first round of impact data collection as the children start to turn 1. So what are we actually going to be doing? In the hospital, when the babies were born, we administered a survey to the moms to better understand family life. At age 1, we're currently going into the homes of these families, again, administering a survey. We're doing a 10-minute free play so that we can observe and code parent-child interactions. We're measuring mom's stress hormones, again, through hair cortisol. We're getting some basic measures of children's language and social emotional development, and we're measuring age 1 brain function using EEG. At age 2, we're going to be doing a very similar home visit, again, measuring most of the same outcomes. And then at age 3, we'll actually be bringing families into our university labs to be able to do an in-depth assessment of children's cognitive, emotional, and brain development. So we'll be able to really carefully measure the impact of this unconditional cash transfer on children's minds and brains. Across the entire study, we are seeking access to administrative records to better understand the kinds of social services and benefits that moms are using. And for a subset of moms, we're engaging in more in-depth qualitative interviews so that we can really have a better picture of the ways this extra economic resources really impacts family life. So how do we think that higher income is likely to play out in these families? We've got 2 main pathways that we're hypothesizing. One we call the increased investment pathway, and that's the idea that with greater economic resources, moms are more likely to be able to purchase things that are good for the child, things like more toys or books or trips to the museum, but also potentially higher quality childcare, better housing, and better neighborhoods. And the other we're calling the reduced stress pathway. And that's the idea that if moms are less worried about how they're going to make their monthly rent check or keep the lights on, they're more likely to be able to engage with their child in the kinds of warm and nurturing ways that we know are so important for child development. Now, chances are both of those pathways are active, perhaps differently in different families. And so, although we're going to be measuring those pathways very carefully, our ultimate impacts of interest are on those on the child. So a few years ago, we did a pilot study here in my lab in New York City with just 30 low-income moms, mostly to test the feasibility of whether it would be possible to recruit and retain families to successfully give out cash. And we were pleased to find that it was feasible. So we had over 93% retention over the course of the year. And importantly, very few problems with implementing the debit card. And that's important because in the pilot study, it was the very first time using a debit card for more than 1 in 5 of those moms. Now, as I mentioned, we're also doing a qualitative study in the larger study. I don't have quotes from that yet, but I do have some quotes back from the pilot study a few years ago, when moms told us that even in small amounts, money tended to make a pretty big difference. So one mom told us, believe it or not, even an extra $20 helps. There were times I found myself completely broke. I go and I use it, and that means I can make it for another week. Another mom told us the money from the card really, really helped me out, especially one month that we didn't have the food stamps. We didn't have anything at all. Now, when we were surveying the moms, most moms told us that they were using the money for the baby or other children in the home, but because we're administering the cash via a debit card, we don't have to just take mom's word for it. We can actually track their transactions. And we're doing this with mom's permission in the larger study as well. So I don't have transaction data for the larger study to share with you just yet, but from the pilot study, where we had 1,112 transactions over the course of that 1-year pilot, you can see that there's quite a range of transactions. And the one I like to point out is that we found exactly 3 in a liquor store. And then, as I mentioned, we are currently in the midst of our age 1 follow-up in the larger study, so I don't have impacts. So I'll have to come back another time once we've got a little bit more data to share with you, as we're going to be, as I mentioned, following these families annually from birth to 3. I can tell you back from the pilot that although it was a very small sample size, so please do take this with a grain of salt, we saw some preliminary benefits in the intervention group compared to the control group in terms of things like higher reports of center-based childcare expenditures, more frequent reports of mother-child activities, and lower reports of household chaos and parenting stress. And so, if we're right and boosting family income can change children's trajectories for the better, it begs the question as to how this may influence policy. So currently, the United States really pales in comparison to our developed country peers when we look at the size of public spending on children and families. But it doesn't necessarily have to be this way. So in this slide, I'm showing you the rates of poverty for senior citizens over time in blue and for children over time in red. And what you see is that back in the late 1950s, more than 1 in 3 of our senior citizens were living in poverty. But with the advent of governmental programs like Social Security and Medicare, that number steadily fell to the fewer than 10% of our senior citizens living in poverty today. In contrast, back in the late 1950s, around 27% of children were living in poverty. And now that number did go down a bit with the advent of Medicaid, but because spending on families with young children has not traditionally been a priority of our government, that number has steadily risen to the 21% we see today. And so I think this is just a good illustration of the fact that governmental programs can influence broad societal factors like poverty, which can have real implications for individuals and families. So it's our hope that the Baby's First Year study will have the potential to provide direct evidence of the effects of poverty reduction on the developing mind and brain. And in turn, that this will inform debates on the generosity or cuts both to existing programs as well as potentially new social service programs that have the potential to affect millions of families with young children. So we can think about things like food stamps or housing vouchers that are frequently on the chopping block on Capitol Hill, as well as other things that have been in the news quite a bit lately, like paid family leave or the minimum wage, for which our results may have direct implications. Because while I would never suggest that income is the only or even the most important factor in determining children's brain development, it may be one that's particularly manipulable from a policy perspective. So with that, I think I'll pause. I'm happy to take questions from Dr. Mason or from the group at large.
Well, let me start. I probably have a dozen, but I'll try to limit it to 3 or 4. Thinking back to your study, looking at your pilot and also your larger study, during the course of the study, did you measure the children's well-being or cognition? And if so, what did you find?
In the pilot, we did not, right? So the pilot of 30 moms, it was really done to sort of test feasibility of whether we could even give out cash in this way and retain a sample. So we did not measure anybody cognitively or really in terms of direct child assessments in the pilot. In the larger study, we have quite a few assessments. So just to sort of spotlight this, because I went a little bit quickly through it. So right now we're about 25% into our age 1 measure. So our very first peek at any kinds of outcomes, right? So, we spent the first year recruiting all 1,000 families, and we completed recruitment in May. And so that means that the children will be turning 1 from this past summer up through the summer of 2020, or late spring of 2020. And so right now, as we go into the homes at age 1, we're getting measures, some basic measures of language and social emotional development, as well as brain function. And so once we have all of the data collected at age 1, we'll be able to share sort of the very first glimpse of impact. And then we'll be doing the same thing at age 2, and finally at age 3, bringing kids and their caretakers into our university labs to be able to do much more in-depth assessments than we can do at the home.
My next question may be one that you can answer better in a year or 2, but I'm thinking about not only the feasibility, but maybe restrictions. So when people came in and they enrolled in the study, were they told, that the debit card could only be used in specific ways? Was there any screening? Did you say that people had to not have a substance abuse addiction or any of those things before you accepted them in the program?
No, so all excellent questions. So it's By design, it's unconditional cash. So moms really are free to spend it however they like. And that's important because it's designed to be a pure test of poverty reduction, right? And so it really can't be, poverty reduction conditioned on certain behavior or cash that can only be spent in certain ways. We've got lots of examples of that in the policy realm, right? Food stamps, for example, or housing vouchers are excellent examples of that. But when you think about, for example, a child tax credit that you or I might get, so when we get a credit like that on our taxes for having children, we're not told how to spend that money. It's just money that comes to us. And yet the poorest 25% of society doesn't earn enough money to pay income tax and therefore doesn't benefit from that kind of credit. And so we're sort of systematically, providing an unconditional cash transfer only for the wealthiest 75% of us.
And it doesn't.
Yeah, go ahead.
It didn't sound like you had any limits in terms of, or differentiation according to size of family.
Right. You asked about, no, we don't. You asked about other screening criteria. So moms need to be 18 or older to provide consent. They need to speak English or Spanish because those are the languages that we have our standardized assessments in. They need to live in the state where we're recruiting them, which is important because we spent quite a number of years prior to the onset of the study securing what are known as clawback waivers. So basically, if I give a woman $333 a month, that might render her ineligible for food stamps, for example, and that would not be a terrific outcome. That would be ethically questionable in addition to a scientifically terrible design, because obviously it would not be good if I was trying to compare two different groups looking at, I'm experimentally manipulating income, but then that leads to other impacts on their benefits, right? So we ensured that for the purposes of this study, these moms won't lose the benefits they otherwise would have been eligible for. And that's state by state. So they had to live in the state where we're recruiting from. They also needed to have the baby planning to go home with them. So not, giving the child up for adoption or going into care of social service, CPS. And they needed to live below the federal poverty line. So those were the inclusion criteria, but we do not exclude based on drug or alcohol use. We are measuring that. You could imagine impacts on substance use or not, and so we'll be able to examine the extent to which poverty reduction does lead to differences in substance use, to the extent that we can, we're asking questions, we're not taking blood samples, but so we'll be able to look at that, but it's not an inclusion or exclusionary criteria. Just as it wouldn't be for a social service receipt.
And it also sounds like you didn't differentiate so that if a family had like 8 children,
you asked about that.
They wouldn't get more, right?
Right. No. So everybody is getting the same. We are, of course, measuring family size, but we are not differentiating across it. And the reason, so we spent a while at the outset sort of conceiving the study, and we thought very hard, should we limit it, for example, to first-time births? And so there were a few reasons not to do that. So you might imagine, well, maybe the money would go further in a first-time birth, right? There's only one child to spend it on. On the other hand, it's also plausible that, a second-time mom might sort of be more adept at managing finances, at mothering in general. So it's not immediately clear who would actually benefit the most from a cash influx. And secondly, we really wanted it to be generalizable across families. And so we wouldn't want the results to sort of be limited in terms of their interpretation to only families with one child.
So I will be fascinated to find out the results of your study. Although it sounds like you have some good indicators in terms of direction.
Yeah, from the pilot for sure. And the scientists involved in the study very firmly believe in an open science approach, meaning that as soon as the data are collected and cleaned, our plan is to post the data so people, in addition to us, can take a look and see what the data show.
Let's go ahead and open the questions up to others now. So I don't know, have there been questions posted on the chat line?
In terms of Well, we should. It wasn't just Ukraine where the aid was held up. I look at it this way.
Someone who has their TV on, could you mute
And
yourself?
the investigations didn't happen.
Try to put the emoji up. Now, how do I type something?
What I can tell you about the Trump policy toward Ukraine.
So we did have one comment on the chat about how this could be something that inspires us to have a call to action for more research in this area, and how perhaps teachers could have a voice in that happening.
For sure. I mean, I think very much it's the case that we need more research to better understand interventions that are going to be effective and probably differently effective for different groups. So I think it would be great to get teacher input, particularly into school-based interventions. I think in many cases researchers might not have the best sense of the kinds of interventions that are going to be feasible in schools and what teachers are going to be able to implement with fidelity. And so I think it's really important to get teacher and school input prior to, spending a lot of time and money designing interventions that may or may not be feasible. Other questions? If there are no further questions, I'll say go ahead and follow me on Twitter if that's your thing. Also, if you want to hear the 12-minute version of what you just heard, you can watch my TED Talk online. Otherwise, many thanks to my lab members, collaborators, and generous funders. I'm very happy to connect offline if people have further questions as well.
Thank you so much. Oh, go ahead.
Well, as we leave and as Dana does the wrap up, I'd just like to say we are going to be following your research. We will try to give updates to everyone as we get them. And if you could just answer one more question for me, that relates to other related research that you may be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So sort of a few things on that front. So one study that we're doing is also an NIH-funded study. We are recruiting a socioeconomically diverse cohort of moms prenatally, pregnant moms here in New York City, and we're planning to follow them and their young children longitudinally from birth to 3. So a little bit different than the experimental approach in which we're changing one thing to see how it affects families. In this case, we're recruiting a diverse group of families and really just measuring over time the emergence of disparities so that we can try to hone in on what's the particular timing of the emergence of disparities, and then what factors might be accounting for those things. And then in terms of other future directions, as I mentioned, the Baby's First Year study is the sort of initial round of the study will be from birth to 3, but it's certainly our hope to follow up the families much longer term than that, certainly through at least school age and hopefully for decades. And so we'll be certainly seeking out ways to be able to do that.
One of our participants just mentioned that she's in Berkshire County in Massachusetts, and they have a similar intervention called the Newborn Behavioral Observations, looking at area hospitals to impact the early interactions between caregivers and infants.
Oh, nice. I'm not familiar with that one, but I'll take a look.
All right. Dr. Noble, thank you again so much for being with us. I'm going to share my screen actually now, so if you don't mind relinquishing powers.
No, please. That's great. I guess I need to do that on my end, don't I? How do I do that?
There's a little, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. Of the fellows and everyone else would just stick around for 1 second. We wanted to remind you that this webinar is a part of the Childhood Trauma Learning Collaborative. And if you are interested in getting more resources about helping your school become more trauma-informed and using mindfulness to create a compassionate school community, please visit us online. And we also want to remind you that our funding comes from Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which requires us to evaluate our services. Attendees who provided their email address will receive an evaluation survey 24 hours after the close of today's event, along with today's slide presentation. The follow-up email will include links to request CEU credits and/or participation certificates. We appreciate your honest, anonymous feedback, which provides information to SAMHSA that will assist us in planning future meetings and programs. We really hope that you make plans to participate in our online upcoming activities. Today was our webinar by Dr. Kim Noble. In December, if you're in the St. Louis area, Dr. Mason and one of our webinar participants and CTLC fellows, Kate Retzel, as well as Dr. Michelle Rivers Murphy, will be presenting at a conference called Learning Forward. In January, we have our next webinar by one of Dr. Noble's postdoc researchers, Dr. Sonia Troller-Renfrey. She's going to be talking about psychosocial deprivation and neurocognitive functioning. And then in February, if you're in the Atlanta area, Dr. Mason and I will also be presenting about the CTLC's activities at the Creating Trauma-Sensitive Schools Conference. For more information, contact us at info@edimprovement.org and stay posted to our website, www.edimprovement.org, for links to the video presentation, related slides, and CTLC fellows, please remain on the line. Everyone else, thank you for joining us.